The Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, was one of the most significant diplomatic meetings of the 20th century. It brought together the big three Allied leaders, Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, to decide the fate of post-war Europe as World War II neared its end. Held at the Levadia Palace in Yalta, Crimea, the conference aimed to shape a new world order but also laid the groundwork for Cold War divisions that would dominate global politics for decades. Background and context. By early 1945, the defeat of Nazi Germany was imminent. The Allies had successfully launched the D-Day invasion in Western Europe, and Soviet forces were advancing from the east. With the end of the war in sight, the Allied leaders convened at Yalta to discuss the post-war reconstruction of Europe, the reorganization of national borders, and the creation of international institutions that could prevent future global conflicts. Key agreements. The Yalta Conference addressed several critical issues, many of which would shape the geopolitical landscape of the second half of the 20th century. 1. Division of Germany. The leaders agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Berlin, the capital, would also be divided similarly, even though it lay deep within the Soviet zone. 2. Eastern Europe and Poland. Stalin, whose forces already controlled much of Eastern Europe, insisted on maintaining Soviet influence in the region. The Allies agreed reluctantly that Eastern Europe would have friendly governments, but promised that free elections would be held. In Poland, Stalin secured a pro-Soviet government, with a vague promise of future democratic elections, a promise that would later be broken, leading to Soviet domination of the region. 3. United Nations formation. The conference paved the way for the establishment of the United Nations. All 3 leaders supported the idea of a new international body to replace the failed League of Nations. They agreed on the structure of the Security Council, including the veto power for the 5 permanent members. 4. War with Japan. Stalin pledged that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In exchange, the Soviets were promised territorial gains in Asia, including parts of Manchuria and the Kuril Islands. 5. Nazi war crimes. The leaders agreed to prosecute Nazi leaders for war crimes, leading to the Nuremberg trials, a landmark in international law. Disagreements and tensions. Despite public declarations of unity, deep tensions simmered beneath the surface. Churchill and Roosevelt were wary of Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe, but they were constrained by the reality on the ground. Soviet troops already occupied much of the region. Some historians argue that Roosevelt, weakened by illness and eager for Soviet support in the Pacific, made too many concessions to Stalin. Churchill famously warned about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, a term he would later use to describe the division between the Soviet-controlled East and the Western democracies. Legacy and consequences. The Yalta Conference marked a turning point in international diplomacy. While it achieved short-term goals, ending the war and establishing new global institutions, it also sowed the seeds of the Cold War. The division of Europe into Soviet and Western spheres of influence led to decades of geopolitical tension, military rivalry, and ideological conflict. Eastern European nations, promised free elections, instead found themselves under authoritarian Soviet regimes. The Yalta agreements, particularly the concessions to Stalin, have since been criticized for enabling Soviet expansionism and betraying smaller nations' aspirations for self-determination. Conclusion. The Yalta Conference was a moment of both hope and compromise. It showcased the ability of wartime allies to work together but also exposed the limits of cooperation in a world shaped by diverging ideologies. While it laid the foundation for the United Nations and helped bring World War II to a close, it also marked the beginning of a new global conflict, the Cold War, that would define international relations for the rest of the 20th century.